I'm Tammy Gaskell, and I'm the director of the Roloff Jansen Community Library and also the current chair of the Columbia County Libraries Association, which is hosting this program as part of its first county-wide community read focused on the book, The Boy Who Inherited the Wind by William Kamkwamba, which, if you have read it, you know is about a young boy who builds a windmill to help save his community in Malawi from a drought. And so we thought it would be really good to see what's happening with wind energy here in New York State. And so we invited Anne Reynolds, who's the executive director of the Alliance for Clean Energy New York, to talk to us about what's happening in New York State. So we are recording this program, so we will post it on the county website after in the next few days. So if you know others who might be interested in watching this, please let them know. It'll be up on the Columbia County Library's website and YouTube channel. Just to let you know, the countywide community read is wrapping up next week with a final program at the Crandall Theater, where we will be showing the movie Boy Who Inherited the Wind, and that will be free. You can buy popcorn and soda, but the movie itself is free. So I am going to now turn this over to Anne, who is going to share her screen and tell us about wind energy in New York State.
Thanks, Tamara, and hello, everyone. Hope you loved the book. I work for an organization called the Alliance for Clean Energy New York and spend my days and nights talking and thinking about wind power, as well as solar energy, battery storage. We work on electric vehicles, energy efficiency for homes, and building decarbonization. So just by way of just introducing my point of view, Alliance for Clean Energy is a dues-paying organization, and the folks paying the dues are clean energy companies. But we have a structure where half of our board of directors is for-profit clean energy companies, and the other half is environmental organizations here in New York State. And we've been around since 2006. And I thought today I would show you a couple short videos. One of them, the first one is 5 minutes long, but we're not going to watch the whole thing. I'm going to stop it in the middle there. And the second one, I think, is 3 or 4 minutes. That one's on offshore wind. So the first video is when we took a group of people to the Free Center, which is called the Fenner, which stands for the Fenner Renewable Energy Center. It's in Cazenovia, New York. So you go out the thruway for an hour and a half or so from Albany. This is the second oldest wind project operating in New York State. And the community that lives there set up a little education center where the wind farm is. And they have like picnic tables and bathrooms and a visitor center would be exaggerating, maybe. It's small. It's basically bathrooms and some educational signs, and it also has a wind turbine blade that's laying out on the grass so visitors can take a look at it, and a lot of school groups go there. They have some solar panels too. So I wanted to mention that because when some of the folks talking are New York politicians, because we put them in a bus and drive them out there to try to teach them about renewable energy. But I mostly want you to see the visuals, which is the wind turbines that are in Fenner, New York, and the blade that's laying along the ground. So I'm going to try to share my screen now and show the video. Bear with me if takes me a couple of times here. Let's see if this one works. And please, Tamara or anyone, give a yell if you can't hear it, or write in the chat that you're having trouble. Good. Folks see that on screen now? Yes.
We're all here because you care. You have a special interest or expertise in green energy. You maybe have made your life's professional commitment to making sure that our children and grandchildren can live in a world that isn't just a healthy and sustainable one, but also one where we can meet their energy demands.
I'm excited to be here because I worked in environmental sustainability for 15 years before I ran for office.
And so it really is imperative, particularly those that hold key leadership positions, to come upstate to see all of the good things that are going on and how our entire state as a whole can and should be benefiting.
Upstate New York, and specifically Central New York, does a fantastic job. We are ahead of the curve at providing a tremendous amount of green energy. The state is really relying on us to continue to be a leader as it relates to our green energy transformation.
Today we're approaching 100-degree weather here in New York. Huge constraints on the grid. Renewables are playing a real active role on a day like today. Demand is very, very high. And we need a diverse resource mix in the state of New York to alleviate the constraints on the grid.
I mean, the wind turbines are generating energy. They're also a revenue generator for landowners who often, farmers work at very, very slim margins, often have a hard time making a profit, and this really helps tilt the economy in their direction a little bit, while also creating energy that we need.
Having these windmills on the farmland has really helped me be able to keep the farmland, because the income from the windmills helps pay for the land and school taxes.
What I think has been most important for us is our relationship with our landowners and communities, and spending that time to have our team in these communities. The coexistence of agriculture and wind energy here we are at Fenner, really is demonstrating that renewable energy can coexist with the agricultural community.
We have a very good relationship with the farmers in the area. They plant crops and cattle graze right up next to the turbines. They harvest corn, small grain, hay. During the wintertime, there's snowmobile trails that go through the park. We really have integrated and created a lot of shared value within the community that we are operating in.
The company that owns the wind project has paid a significant amount of money to the town of Fenner. And in doing that, the land and the school taxes for the town of Fenner residents has been considerably lower than our neighboring communities.
An issue that is so important to us down on Long Island isn't just the development of renewable energy that is safe, that is sustainable, that is affordable, but also creating the green, new energy jobs of the future. And hard-working men and women of labor, together with so many of our outstanding educational institutions, have really taken great strides in providing that kind of education and ensuring that particularly our young people that are interested in this area have every opportunity to be a part of that emerging economy for generations to come.
When we first started, you can understand that the procedures that
Okay, so the rest of that video is about SUNY Morrisville's Renewable Energy Training Program, which is actually a really interesting program if you know any young people that want to go into this field. But before I go any further, just wondering if anyone had any questions about that video, about where we were and that type of thing. I wanted you to see the scale of them. These turbines are very large. And also the setting of them tends to be on ridge tops, like that was, because you need to be in a place that's windy, obviously. Ridge tops are the best, and near transmission lines. And have open land available to lease. All of the wind projects in New York are built on land that's still owned by individual landowners. So a company in developing a project comes to a community and inquires with the landowners if they're interested in leasing their land for these turbines. The company doesn't buy up the land to install the turbines, but they do it on lease land. So any questions about that? All right, so you're gonna learn more about wind power than you ever wanted to know. Let me go then to some slides that I have just to walk through where things stand in New York, because you happen to be reading this book at a time when there's a lot going on in wind energy in New York State. Now, let me just ask, can you guys see these slides on screen and hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. So the Alliance for Clean Energy had started an offshoot organization called the New York Offshore Wind Alliance. That's made up of companies that are trying to develop offshore wind projects as well as environmental groups. So those are two parts of our organization there on the first slide. As I mentioned, we are a broad coalition. We work to promote the clean energy industry. I come from an environmental background. Prior to working at East New York, I was at the Department of Environmental Conservation here in Albany, and they're in their state headquarters. And I worked for other environmental groups in Albany as well as in Boston, and started my career at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in New York City. We tried to promote clean, renewable electricity technologies and energy efficiency in New York, because we really think that this is a great way to reduce pollution, but also boost economic development. So we try to promote both sides of that coin in terms of the benefits of clean energy. So why we care about wind and why the state of New York is promoting wind energy development. Basically, you're making electricity, which we all use, with no air pollution, no greenhouse gases, which is what causes climate change, but also no carbon dioxide or particulates or other pollutants that cause public health problems. So it's a great way to clear the air. Wind energy is a very capital intensive undertaking. These are big, expensive machines, the theme of your book notwithstanding. But the good news is once they're built, there's no ongoing fuel costs. So, not only is those energy dollars not going out of state into a coal mine or a gas drilling operation out of state or even out of the country, it does mean that if you have more and more of your electricity coming from renewables, you are hedging against the price spikes that happen with natural gas and other fossil fuels. So on the one hand, it is expensive to build these projects and to invest in wind energy. I don't want to downplay that. But I know some headlines after the terrible events in Israel and Gaza in the Wall Street Journal were about oil prices spiking the next day. And then a week later, as fighting intensified, fossil fuel prices were increased again. So each time there's turmoil in the world, certainly the Russian invasion of Ukraine is no exception. Those prices spike, and we all feel that. And so the more renewable energy we have, it should be more stable prices over time. We like it that when you have wind turbines, the farmers can farm right up to the base of the wind turbines. They can graze cattle, for example, right around the turbines. There's a lot of job opportunities in the wind industry. And because these are projects that are supported by the state of New York, they do require prevailing wage, union labor peace agreements, incentives to hire workers in New York State, that type of thing. But these private companies are bringing that investment to New York, and it's being matched by the state. So they do make a lot of local tax payments, as you heard in that video. And they usually do that through pilot agreements, which stands for payments in lieu of taxes. They're negotiated tax agreements. That next bullet is not accurate. I think that's a typo. And it makes me think that I'm looking at the wrong version of this PowerPoint. But we'll keep going and we'll see. The costs have declined in wind and solar for years, although now increasing because of inflation. And as more wind projects are built around the country, the grid operators are getting more used to how to balance that and how to predict it. And predicting the power generation from wind has become a very mature science. And so they're usually able to predict when they would have to turn on and off other generation based on wind and solar. So the context, though, here in New York for developing renewables is that Our legislature passed a bill in 2019 called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, and it requires that 70% of the electricity we use come from renewable sources by 2030. That's super ambitious. I'm here to tell you I am the biggest cheerleader for renewable energy and a very optimistic person. I'm not sure we're going to make that, but I think it's a lot of benefits for New York if we really push for it. We have 29% renewable electricity in New York now, and that's mostly from the hydro plants at Niagara Falls and the St. Lawrence River that are operated by the New York Power Authority. But there are, and we really have about 5% wind and solar power. In terms of 5% of the electricity we use comes from wind and solar now. There's other states that have a lot more wind and solar. States, like Kansas and Iowa already have a significant portion of their electricity coming from wind. Germany has 50% of its electricity coming from wind power at the moment. The law also required that the investments that the state makes in this energy transition have to be equitably spread across the state, with 35% directed to disadvantaged communities, which is something that's defined in the law. So a little bit about how a turbine works. I mentioned when I was asked to do this, I'm not an engineer, so if you get to some really technical questions, my face will soon go blank and someone else will have to answer. But it's worth talking about the basic workings of a wind turbine. Is the wind turns the blades. It's capturing kinetic energy in order to generate electricity. This section here, where the gears are and the shafts, is called the nacelle. Then these are called the blades. I don't know if my cursor is appearing on screen here, but the gearbox converts that power, transfers it to a generator, and then the electricity is delivered to the power grid, usually from underground transmission lines that go to a substation from each individual turbine, and then an above ground transmission line that goes from there to the main part of the grid. People often are amazed at how big these are, and they are getting bigger. So those ones that you saw in that video at Fenner are probably closest to this second from the left. I think they're maybe 1.3 megawatts. They're not 1.8. So more and more people are installing larger turbines, and you can see by comparison, this 3 megawatt turbine is the farthest on the right. That would be the top of where the blades start, would be equal to the Washington Monument. When the towers get higher, they can capture more wind at higher elevations. And when the blades get longer, they're generating more electricity with each rotation, so the capacity factor for the turbines increases. So what's going on in New York now? Has anyone ever seen a wind facility, a wind park in New York State? Any of you? Ever?
There's one. This is Tammy, and I see one when I'm driving north on the Taconic State Parkway. I see one. I don't know where it's located, but perhaps it's in Rensselaer County, or maybe it's across the border in Massachusetts. I'm not sure.
I'm not sure. So we, just a couple terms. I use the term grid scale wind, which makes electricity and sells that to the grid. There are some smaller turbines that are generating electricity to be used at that location, some 10 kilowatt machines that are smaller, although that might be a facility over the border in Massachusetts, I'm guessing. But believe it or not, it's a big state. So there's 24 wind parks operating in New York State now. They have just over 2,000 megawatts of generating capacity. The turbines on those 24 parks are different sizes. So like the ones you saw in the video are the older ones. The more recently constructed ones are larger than that. They look a little different, more sort of slimmer, a little sleeker, and definitely taller. So they each have different capacities. So you can't just like divide 2050 by 2 to find out how many turbines there are. But there are, so I don't know exactly how many towers there are, but there's definitely over 1,000. And 233 megawatts of capacity to generate wind power was added just last year. These projects are built in New York because they get a 20-year contract with the state of New York. And there's 7 more wind projects that have been awarded contracts that haven't been built yet. So they're in the middle of trying to get their permits. It's a lengthy, years-long process to get a permit to be built in New York. And if you get a contract from the state of New York, it doesn't mean that you're going to get a permit. It's called a conditional award. And then you have to go through the permitting process. You also have to go through the process of interconnecting to the grid, which takes another 3 years, hopefully in parallel. And that's a very serious process to interconnect a new power generator to the grid, because there's a lot of technical issues and reliability issues that they have to work through. So those 7 projects are winding their way through the process, and when they will get built, if they all get built, it would be in about another 1,400 megawatts of power. And we're thinking under the climate law, we would need about 5,500 gigawatt. Oh, sorry, that should be megawatts. That's 5,500 megawatts to achieve the goals. So, you know, we still would have some way to go after there. So once again, that's a typo. It should be 5,500 megawatts, not gigawatts. Does someone have a question about anything?
There are a couple of comments or questions in the chat. One is a question about, where did I? The percentage of the time, what percentage of the time do windmills produce usable electricity?
Yeah. Oh, I'm glad you mentioned. I didn't have the chat open, so I can go through some of those. So the turbines are only turning when the wind is blowing. And actually, if the wind gets to above a certain speed, they stop turning and they feather the blades. And so they don't want to like spin like crazy. So the more recent turbines are getting higher capacity factors, but I'd say like on average, these turbines on land in upstate New York have about a 40% capacity factor. That means it doesn't exactly mean 40% of the time, because they could be spinning more, but not fully spinning. But the easiest way to think of it as 40% of the time they're creating electricity and transmitting that electricity to the grid. The offshore wind turbines have higher capacity factors because they're bigger and because the winds are more steady and strong offshore. But your capacity factor really depends on where you're located and how windy it is in that location. We have some comments about some turbines in Madison County. Yep, that was an early project, Madison Wind. I answered the one about what percentage of time. The cost declines. So for the last, I'd say 15 years, the price of wind turbines has been dropping as they've gotten, and that's on a per megawatt hour basis. So as they've gotten more efficient, as the manufacturing facilities have gotten more efficient, as manufacturing facilities moved to the US from Europe, there's some maybe a couple dozen manufacturing sites in the country that each create or manufacture parts of wind turbines. The largest is a Vestas facility in Colorado, although General Electric does relatively recently development some wind turbine component manufacturing here in Schenectady. So as the supply chain developed in the US and the manufacturing got more, up at scale and sophisticated, the prices was dropping. What has happened basically since COVID is because of inflation, the prices have gone back up. And it wasn't just straight up inflation that was affecting like the price of eggs. It's also, we were still depending on a lot of supply chain from Europe, and the European countries really doubled down on their own renewable energy goals after Russia invaded Ukraine. So a lot of the demand for renewables went up because of that, and also because of passage of the IRA here in the US. So because of demand, the cost of installation has gone up, and New York State, especially the cost of labor, is going up. So we were on a downward trajectory for a good long time. It started to go up, but hopefully that will level out again, and if not decrease, at least be at a new normal and not increasing more. There's a question about tornadoes and wind turbines. So they are designed to withstand strong winds like that. I don't have too many anecdotes about them either surviving or not just surviving, though. I do know that in the 10 years that, like, that Madison one went up in probably 2003. So in the 20 years, I haven't heard of any in New York tumbling over because of tornadoes, but I don't actually know more details than that about their design features. I know the offshore wind turbines are designed to handle hurricane winds up to a certain category level. There is some concern about putting turbines in the Gulf of Mexico near Louisiana, although there are companies that are leasing land with the intention to do that, because they do have stronger hurricanes there and more frequently than we do up here. Okay, that's all the questions I see in chat, but I'd love to have more questions, so just type them right on in there. I'll try to keep that open. This slide is meant to just show where in New York turbines are. So they're sort of clustered in those yellow circles on the left. This map on the right, just last week, the governor announced 22 new projects had gotten contracts. And so it's, as you can see from this map, it's not all wind projects. It's some solar wind projects, some solar projects, and some wind projects. Most of these, the ones that have Valcor in the name, are existing wind projects that have been up for about, let's see, they all went up around 2012. So they've been up for maybe 11 years, and they're going to get repowered, meaning they're going to install more modern and efficient turbines to generate more electricity at the same sites. And one of them, the one that's called North Country Wind that you see way up there near the Canadian border, that's going to be a new project. And those are the ones that just got awarded contracts from NYSERDA last week. They do that annually, or they're set to do that annually, have a competition where these companies bid in and try to see if they can win a contract from NYSERDA. And they're supposed to do that annually between now and 2026 in order to meet this goal of having enough projects constructed so that 70% of our electricity comes from renewables in 2030. What is more economical? So we have a question from chat. What is more economical to install, solar panels or wind? So good question. So as I mentioned, each year NYSERDA puts out this solicitation, and these companies come and put in bids, and they are evaluated in this competition 70% based on the price that they bid and 30% based on other factors, which includes, you know, how many jobs you're going to create, what investments are you going to make in New York State. And then there's also some points evaluated, like how viable is the project? Is it likely to be permitted? Is it far along in the interconnection process? That type of thing. So they look at price, and they look at project viability and economic benefits. And I'd say up until maybe 2016 or 15 was the first time that solar won. So between 2003 and 2016, it was all wind projects that won every year. Solar was just too expensive compared to wind. And then that flopped around 2016. and that some solar won, and 2017 some solar won, and I think it was in 2018 that no wind projects at all won. And you can see this map here that it's just one new wind project and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 repowering of wind projects, and the rest are solar. So the price of solar panels had decreased so much that it was more economical on a dollars per megawatt hour basis to install solar than wind. So it's kind of neck and neck now. Some communities had sound restrictions for wind turbines, yes, and there have been communities that have passed laws saying they didn't want any wind or solar, moratoria on wind and solar. There's been opposition to some projects. It's a real struggle. I can talk about that in great detail if people are interested. The next question, though, is any plans for offshore wind projects in New York? There definitely is. And then the next question is, does solar power have more waste than wind power? Well, that is a hard question to answer. In New York, there's only been one wind project that's ever been taken down, really, because we just started building them 20 years ago. And that was just in the past year. There's efforts underway from both the wind side and solar side to recycle the materials, and there's a lot of research going on. There's the ability to recycle a lot of the materials now, but not all of them. So I'm not sure. I actually don't know, like on a per megawatt hour basis, who has more waste. But I will say, what we really need to do is develop recycling facilities for solar panels. Steel gets recycled in the US, and so the majority of your wind turbines will be steel. There's a recycling infrastructure for that. For the solar panels themselves, not the racking, we need to develop that recycling infrastructure. And I was talking to the governor's office today about a bill. I don't know if they'll go for it, but I think it would be a good idea. All right, let me see what the next slide is, but keep those questions coming. So offshore wind is the same thing except offshore. It uses the same process for energy generation. The electricity is sent via buried cables to shore. And then you could have a substation offshore that several wind parks would connect to, and then the cable would be buried and come ashore. Or you can have a radial connection from each wind park to shore. There's a point of connection onshore, underground, and then it goes to the main grid that way. There is only one operating wind farm in the United States right now. It's right off Block Island, which is an island off Rhode Island. It was a very interesting place to have the first project because they had no transmission line to that island. So the power on Block Island, which is a beautiful place if you've ever been there, was all from diesel generators. So they had to ship the diesel oil to the island. They'd burn it in very old and polluting diesel generators, not modern at all. And if, they had some sort of fuel interruption, not that I know that happened much, they had no transmission interconnection to shore. So the developer of that project included a transmission line that would go to shore so that when the wind turbines were generating more electricity than Block Island needs, it would go to Rhode Island. And when they weren't generating enough electricity for Block Island, if the wind wasn't blowing, the power would come from Rhode Island to Block Island. So it's kind of a cool project, but very unique in that it was located within state waters because it's an island. All the rest of the offshore wind turbines are going to be in federal waters in the United States, so farther from shore. There's actually, though, 3 projects under construction right now. Vineyard Wind, which is going to connect into Massachusetts. South Fork Wind Farm, which is connecting into the eastern end of Long Island. And Ocean Wind 1, which is connecting into New Jersey. I have a question mark there because I know that they got their permit and they were ready to start construction, but I don't actually know if construction started. But believe it or not, although it's brand new here, still offshore wind has been operating in Europe for 20 years. There's a lot of offshore wind turbines operating in Europe. I had an opportunity to travel to Germany in September and see the offshore turbines that they have in the North Sea. We took a plane ride out over them to see it's really interesting to look at. And then there's also, believe it or not, and this amazes me, these floating wind projects. So all the projects thus far that have contracts in New York are going to be in relatively shallow waters off on the continental shelf. They're going to be fixed to the ground. But there's people developing floating offshore wind turbines for super deep waters for the West Coast, for example, because it drops very precipitously offshore. For Oregon and Washington and California, they're looking into using this floating technology. And there's one floating pilot turbine operating, I think, off the coast of Spain. Okay, so that's offshore wind. And actually, I was going to, at this point, pause to show another short video so you can see some visuals of what offshore wind looks like. So bear with me here as I try to, let's see if this works. Nope, that's not the right one. Hold on. You don't want to see the same video twice. All right, let's see if this works. Do folks see on a beach on screen now?
Yes.
Good. Okay, let's try the sound.
Did you know that New York State is currently developing and building offshore wind energy?
This is exactly what New York State needs to be investing in. Climate change is real. I'm concerned for my children and their future, and we need clean energy, like offshore wind.
Offshore wind is a source of renewable energy. Turbines in the ocean harness strong winds to generate power. This electricity is transported back to the shore through buried cables and served to the grid to be used by homes and businesses.
Just one rotation of a turbine can provide enough energy to power the average home for 2 days. Offshore wind is a powerful, clean resource that captures energy around the clock. It's reliable and locally produced.
Right now, there are multiple ports onshore and areas in the Atlantic Ocean, between 15 and 60 miles out, being developed as part of offshore wind farms as the start of a new homegrown clean energy industry. New York has several active projects that will each produce tremendous amounts of clean energy for our state, for less than $1 per month on our utility bills.
These projects will bring billions of dollars in private sector investment and create 10,000 jobs in our state. This is really important for New York's post-COVID recovery.
Starting with manufacturing, we're making wind turbine components right here in the capital region.
We're assembling the turbines here in the New York Harbor at the city-owned South Brooklyn Marine Terminal before they're shipped to their final destinations off the coast of Long Island.
I've been living here my entire life, and I'm excited to hear that we're getting offshore wind energy for New York.
With plans to power 6 million homes by 2035, New York is leading the nation in offshore wind development with a focus on ocean stewardship. That's a lot of clean, renewable energy for a greener and more resilient New York State. To learn more about offshore wind in New York State, visit offshorewind.ny.gov.
Alrighty.
So my wife got me this weird new tool for Christmas. And at first, I thought it looked kind of crazy. But after using it...
I thought that was someone, one of you talking about your wife, but no, it's an ad that came on over after the video. So that's the answer to the question about what's New York doing on offshore wind right now. And that video was about maybe 15 months old. So there are some new development too. So let me go back to the slides. I I talked about most of this, but a couple things to mention. All of the actual footage of turbines in that video was not from the United States. Those were all shots from Europe, because I mentioned there's just the one offshore wind park that's operating in the United States now. It's off of Block Island, and it's only 6 turbines. So it's not like those big arrays that you see. That was probably the North Sea, or maybe off of UK somewhere. But the relating to the person's question about how often they are generating electricity, the capacity factor for the offshore wind turbines are more like 60%, definitely over 50. Some of them are approaching 65%. So they're able to make more electricity. You can also have larger turbines because there's not those same land use conflicts as there is on land. And also, these turbines now are very large, and they're very large components. So it's impossible to move those blades on roads. You have to move them on water. So you saw in that video how there's some ports developing to serve this industry in Queens and in Albany. And the expectation is these large components will be able to travel down the Hudson River. And there's also that you saw in the video, the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal. The language in the video is, we're manufacturing it here in Upstate, and we're doing this in South Brooklyn. That's not happening yet. That's the plan for projects that have contracts. But they are able to have much larger turbines offshore because you can transport those very heavy, very large components by boat. And also, as it says on this slide, 80% of Americans live close to the coast. And so that's where the majority of the electricity demand is. So if we want to transition to renewable energy in a big way, we need to do it with offshore wind. In New York, we still have the capacity for solar and wind development on land upstate. It's not that that's all done yet, but we already know we really could not get to 70% renewable electricity without offshore wind, given how many people live on Long Island and in the New York City metropolitan area. So that's why
this thing about wind power in New York State.
Sorry, I didn't hear the beginning of your question. Oh, you're talking to someone in your room, probably. I bet. Okay. Sorry. Let me see if there's any questions in the chat. Nope. Okay. And we'll go on to the next slide. So on the left, you can see where there's different facilities have been announced already to service the offshore wind industry or to serve the supply chain. So as you see, it's mostly in the East Coast because that's where all the action is. Electricity is already more expensive, so offshore wind is more competitive. These are states that have shallow waters close to shore, lots of electric load, and state governments that are interested in renewable energy. But there's going to be a lot of expected economic growth in the Gulf of Mexico, because when it comes to knowing how to do electrical work offshore, to travel offshore for construction and installation, there's a lot of experience in Texas and Louisiana from the oil and gas industry. And they also have vessel manufacturing there. And there is a federal law that I never knew about before I did this work, called the Jones Act, that says that if you're servicing U.S. ports, you have to have a U.S. built vessel. It's a little more complicated than that, but it means that in order to service this industry, we have to build some specialized vessels here in the United States. So all of this is underway. It's an emerging early industry, but it is happening. And on the right-hand side here, we have a map of different projects that are planned for New York. So we'll see. We're hoping that they all get built, but the only one that's under construction I mentioned is this small pink area in the upper right-hand corner. It looks like it's south of Newport, Rhode Island. That's the South Fork Wind Farm. It's going to generate electricity there and travel on this dotted green line into this East Hampton substation and serve Long Island. The other, in 2022, the state did a solicitation and awarded these orange projects. Just last week, the governor made this announcement in Queens. These are 3 projects to serve the state. The last awards were announced a year and some ago. They were from a 2020 solicitation. That's the dark blue. And then the aqua blue were projects that were announced because of a 2018 solicitation. And just as I mentioned for land-based wind, these companies are coming in, they're competing with each other to win a contract. It's based 70% on the price and 30% on other factors. And they have, one of the very challenging things is they have to find a place to interconnect in New York City or Long Island. And the New York Harbor is a very busy harbor used for all sorts of things. So they have to negotiate where those transmission lines can go. There was a lengthy multi-year negotiation to designate these wind energy areas. And that's why there are all these strange shapes, because they're what the federal government does what they call de-risking, where they enter into negotiations with the Department of Defense, the NOAA, National Marine Fisheries, the Coast Guard, and they try to find slices of the ocean floor that could be used for this without interfering with fisheries and defense and navigation and cruise boats or whatever. So that's why there are all these funny shapes. And the ones that are outlined in blue but aren't colored, where a company is signed a lease with the federal government for that land, but has not yet won a contract with the state of New York. So, and it also shows that there's these plans for the Port of Albany and Port of Queens a little closer to home. I will say, when I started advocating for offshore wind program in New York State, and talking to different people, there was a lot of interest in having economic development spread out, even upstate, and we didn't know if that would happen, and it has started to happen. So that's really great news and exciting, I think, for the state. Okay, here's a slide that shows how big these things are. And so you can see the average onshore US turbine is 466 feet, still big. So that would be like the first video that we watched in Fenner. But the ones that are going to be installed offshore are much bigger than that. You have the Block Island offshore wind projects there on the end. That's 590 feet. This GE Halliday, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but it's huge. It's 12 megawatts. It's very big. And so that's what I'm saying about how you have to use that size turbines offshore, because you couldn't move that stuff on roads. And that is the end of that. So I have made my way through my slides and those 2 videos, and so we have one question in the chat: how much power is generated by water? So here in New York State, we have a lot of hydro electric generation. I mentioned that 29% of the electricity in the state is renewable, but only 5% of that is wind and solar. So about 24%. So a quarter of the power that's used in the whole state comes from hydroelectric, mostly from the big NYPA projects at Niagara Falls and the St. Lawrence River, but actually there's dozens of small hydroelectric facilities around the state too. And there's a big new transmission line being built. It's under construction now, called the Champlain Hudson Power Express. People call it Chippy. And it's a line that's going all the way from the Canadian border into New York City to deliver hydroelectric power from Canada down into the city of New York. It's a great way to get clean, pollution-free power into the city. That's the good news. I know the members of ACE were a little annoyed that it's like a highway with no entrance ramps. We wanted to be able to sell renewable energy and move it into New York City that way. That didn't happen, but there's a second transmission line plan called Clean Path New York to deliver wind and solar power into the city. And the next question is, what kinds of protections are provided for marine animals and for migrating birds? So that's a really good question. So I mentioned that the Block Island wind farm is the only one that's going to be in state waters, and the rest of them are going to be in federal waters. And that means that their permits need to come from the federal government, from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. So they are subject to all of the same environmental standards as any other project in the country, even though they're offshore. They have to do years of bird studies. If there's a migratory bird pathway of special significance, it wouldn't be a good place for offshore. It wouldn't happen that offshore wind turbines would be there, and that's another challenge with Louisiana that I mentioned. There are protections for marine mammals. The ones I know the most about is with South Fork Wind, which is under construction now, and Block Island, that they have to do before, during, and after surveys of marine mammals. Mostly the right whale is the species of most concern. And during the construction phase, they can be affected by the it's not called drilling, but the foundation work. And so they have protocols where if they spot whales within the area during construction, they have to stop construction until the whale exits a certain area. And that's during the construction phase. It's not believed that there's any effects on mammals after the construction phase is done. There's these structures in the water that they swim around. They have become, in Germany, which is different than it's going to be in the United States, they don't allow fishing near the turbines, and they've basically become marine sanctuaries, and they greatly increase the fish populations because they act as artificial reefs. In the United States, they're still going to allow fishing within the arrays, and the commercial fishing industry, you know, where you hire a charter boat and go out, is kind of looking forward to it off South Fork in terms of business there. That's a very short answer to a major question about protections for animals and migrating birds, but I have to say that there has been a ton of misinformation about offshore wind and dangers to whales that started essentially with a show by Tucker Carlson, and it kind of entered into the online, what would you call it, chaos of misinformation. There have been whale deaths in New Jersey and New York State, Long Island this summer that have been increased. And so, and it was being blamed on offshore wind, but as I mentioned, there really isn't a lot of offshore wind operating yet. So the contention that this increase in whale deaths was caused by that rather than by vessel strikes because of more vessel traffic and the whales themselves migrating to different areas because of temperature changes in the water is the more likely explanation for that. So if you want to learn about that, there's a lot of information online and much of it is untrue. So try to go to some good sources for that. And then the last question is, how supportive of wind power and other renewables are the governor and the legislature? So they're very supportive. We have one of the strongest pieces of climate legislation in the country. But it's also one of the hardest states to build renewables. And my explanation for this, and you're getting a big dose of my own opinion here, is that New York State loves renewables to death in the sense that there's a lot more requirements to do. Like it takes 3 or 4 years to get a permit in New York State, whereas in Ohio, where they don't like renewables, in theory, you can get a permit in 9 months. It's just very difficult to build things in New York. There's a lot of requirements to avoid certain construction windows because of bat populations or grassland bird migrations. The labor costs are higher, prevailing wage. It's hard to get permits and interconnections in New York. But on the other hand, the legislation in favor of renewables and climate action is very strong. So that's what we're balancing. A lot of folks who say, I love renewables, but not here. And I love renewables, but this is not the right place for this solar project because I just bought my home here and I like the view without it. And so that's the struggles in New York. New York has a very proud tradition of citizen involvement in land use and siting. It's what makes it a nice place. It also makes it hard to build renewable energy. So that's what we're constantly balancing. Any other questions? I know you're thinking, well, I didn't want to know this much about wind power, but here you are, all full of new facts. Back to you tomorrow. I don't see any questions.
Okay, well, if there aren't any more, the other comment I see is great presentation. Thank you. And I will second that.
My pleasure. My husband's been telling me for years I need to read that book. So I'll go read it.
All right. Well, thank you very much for enlightening us on this topic, which I